I'd like to turn now to a couple of Catholic authors, Karl Rahner and Edward Schillebeeckx. I find it fascinating that Rahner was heavily influenced by Martin Heidegger, the same philosopher who influenced Rudolf Bultmann. But Rahner took a very different approach to theology. Rahner's approach to theology is what we technically call an anthropocentric approach. An anthropocentric approach to theology is one that starts with humanity. It starts with the human condition and then asks questions. What can Jesus do or say? What can Jesus reveal about the human condition? And so with specific reference to the resurrection, Karl Rahner's starting point was an understanding of the human person, specifically an understanding of our freedom and death. For Karl Rahner, Christian faith both confirms and fulfills human hope. So, a way that I like to put Rahner's approach to the resurrection is to pose the question, what can the resurrection of Jesus say about human hope in relation to human freedom and to death? In answering that, Rahner has a very interesting approach to death. He doesn't regard death as personal extinction. Rather, Rahner holds that death relates to life as a final state, a state that includes or encapsulates all of what he calls the constitutive dimensions of human existence. That is, death is the permanent, personal validation of a person's life. Now that sounds incredibly complex, so to put that into more plain language, we can think of death as the time that summarizes who we are. So if we think about when we go to a funeral, if we go through a funeral ritual, whether it's a Christian funeral or another funeral ritual, we will have not just a commitment to God in the funeral, but we will have something like a eulogy or a statement of who that person was and what they stood for. That is, in death, we appreciate, we celebrate, we tell the story of who that person was. That's Rahner's approach, which he puts in more intense, more complex terms. So the death of Jesus for Rahner was not an altogether bad thing, but it was a validation or a statement of who he was as a person. So the death of Jesus was the validation of the Son of God who exercised perfect human freedom. How does he see the resurrection then? The resurrection is the outcome of the life and death of Jesus. Another way of putting that point is that for Rahner, the resurrection is not something that defeats the death of Jesus, but rather the resurrection completes the life and death of Jesus. And so Rahner is opposed to a theology that sees the death of Jesus as a bad thing, and at the same time as opposing a death of Jesus theology that sees it as a bad thing, he also opposes a theology that sees the resurrection as some sort of vindication against death, as if it was a bad thing. Having said that, Rahner is not altogether clear on the witnesses to the resurrection. To my knowledge, he makes no clear statements about the body of Jesus, although he does write about the resurrection of Jesus in terms of Jesus risen being part of the disciples' range of perception. We can contrast Rahner with the theology of Edward Schillebeeckx. In what we've just said about Rahner, we could be forgiven for thinking that death is a good thing, because Rahner saw death as that permanent validation of a person's life and meaning. So it's probably unfair to say it, but we could be forgiven for thinking that for Rana, the death of Jesus was good. Schillebeeckx, on the other hand, sees death, and specifically the death of Jesus, as a bad thing. The death of Jesus, for Schillebeeckx, was the culmination of human weakness. It was an act of cruelty, injustice, and ultimately failure. So Rana sees the resurrection as the continuation of the death of Jesus. Schillebeeckx sees the resurrection of Jesus as victory over death. Against all the indignity, all the injustice, all the torture of Jesus and his death, the resurrection for Schillebeeckx stands as a correcting victory. An interesting aspect of the theology of Schillebeeckx is in the verification of the resurrection. He doesn't see this specifically as seeing Jesus risen in the way that you or I would see any object in the same room that we're in now. But Schillebeeckx sees the resurrection in terms of the experience of Jesus risen in one's life of grace, in one's experience of living one's life in the Spirit of Jesus. In other words, Jesus is alive in our lives very now. You can probably understand how Schillebeeckx attracted attention from the church authorities with such comments. We may have an opinion about that perspective, but I think the beauty of the position of Schillebeeckx was that he was trying to tie together the experience of the early disciples with the faith experience of people today. In other words, Schillebeeckx is trying to say that the resurrection of Jesus is not just a formula that we assent to, but the resurrection for us today is something that should give us a life-changing experience that helps us to live in the Spirit of Jesus. There is a criticism, though, that as useful as that theology is, that it may perhaps confuse the resurrection of Jesus and his appearances to people with the life of grace and conversion of his followers. So what I've done there is to cover a couple of Protestant scholars and a couple of Catholic scholars on the resurrection. In the next video, I'm going to turn to my own thinking on the resurrection of Jesus, and I hope you find that informative.